Some places have been on your bucket list for years. This was one of those places for me. We had just finished our Volusia County bingo passports, and before heading home, made one last stop at Bulow Plantation Ruins Historic State Park. Dusty had talked about visiting here for a long time, so finally getting to share it together made this stop feel a little more special. At first glance, it's beautiful. Towering oaks draped in Spanish moss, palmettos reclaiming the landscape, massive coquina walls rising from the forest floor. It's peaceful, almost too peaceful, because the longer we walked these trails, the more we realized this isn't simply a collection of old ruins. It's the remains of an empire built on forced labor. It's the aftermath of a war. And it's one of those places where history refuses to stay buried. Standing here today, it's hard to imagine what this place sounded like nearly 200 years ago. Instead of birds and rustling leaves, there would have been the constant roar of a steam-powered sugar mill. Oxen hauling wagons. Workers cutting sugarcane beneath the Florida sun. Orders being shouted across the plantation. For the owners, those sounds represented wealth. For nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children, they represented something very different. Today we're exploring the Bulow Plantation ruins and uncovering the stories these walls still have to tell. Standing beside these massive walls, it's easy to admire the engineering. The walls are thick. The craftsmanship is impressive. Even after surviving fire, war, hurricanes, and almost 2 centuries of Florida weather, they're still standing. But then you realize something. None of this built itself. Charles Bulow established this plantation in 1821, and within only a few years it had grown into one of East Florida's largest sugar plantations, with thousands of acres under cultivation. Sugar was incredibly profitable. Bulowville wasn't simply a farm. It was an industrial operation built around producing sugar and molasses on a massive scale. But every bit of that success depended upon enslaved labor. An 1830 census records 197 enslaved people living and working here, though historians believe the population likely changed over time. Every stone surrounding us, every field that was cleared, every machine that operated here existed because of their labor. It's easy to walk through places like this and think only about the owners. History often does. But the people who truly built Bulow weren't the Bulow family. They were the enslaved craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the quarry workers, the sugar makers, the families whose names rarely appear in history books. These weren't simply laborers. Operating a 19th century sugar mill required tremendous skill. They quarried the coquina, constructed these buildings, operated complex machinery, processed sugar using techniques requiring knowledge passed from worker to worker. Archaeologists have uncovered artifacts from the areas where these families lived. Simple personal belongings, tools, fragments of everyday life. Small reminders that even under unimaginable hardship, people held on to their identities, their traditions, and their humanity. That's a story worth remembering. One thing we really hoped to find were traces of the old slave quarters. We followed the trail expecting to come across some visible remains, but we never really did. Oddly enough, that almost made the story even sadder. The sugar mill still stands. The plantation house is marked. Visitors naturally gather around the largest surviving structures. But the homes of the people who built this place have almost disappeared beneath the forest. History has a way of preserving the symbols of wealth while quietly erasing the people who created it. And that's exactly why places like this deserve to be interpreted carefully. If you enjoy exploring the forgotten places that shaped our history, not just learning what happened, but understanding the people whose stories have faded with time, I'd love to have you join us. Every week we travel to places just like this, uncovering forgotten stories one stop at a time. So if that's your kind of adventure, be sure to subscribe and come explore with us. As tragic as life already was here, an even larger conflict was unfolding across Florida. The Second Seminole War had begun. The United States government was forcing the Seminole people from their homeland through Indian removal policies, and resistance quickly turned into one of the longest and costliest wars in American history. Interestingly, John Joachim Bulow, the young man who inherited the plantation, reportedly maintained a better relationship with the local Seminoles than many neighboring plantation owners. Accounts suggest he opposed turning his plantation into part of the conflict, but events soon moved beyond his control. In late 1835, Florida militia forces occupied the plantation and converted it into a military outpost. Whether John Bulow wanted it or not, Bulowville had become part of the war. Only weeks later, Seminole warriors and their allies attacked. The plantation burned, the mansion, the sugar mill, the outbuildings, the cabins, nearly everything was destroyed. Contemporary accounts described such an enormous fire that its glow could reportedly be seen for miles across the night sky. Bulow escaped with the retreating militia. His fortune disappeared almost overnight. He died later that same year before reaching 30 years old. The plantation was never rebuilt. One thing I love about Florida is how quickly nature reclaims what people abandon. Almost everywhere we looked, the forest was slowly wrapping itself around history. Palmettos pushed against old foundations. Tree roots wound around stone walls. Spanish moss softened the edges of buildings that once represented incredible wealth. At one point, Dusty suddenly stopped me. Snake. Sure enough, a danger noodle was crossing the same trail I'd walked only a couple minutes earlier, before quietly disappearing into the brush. For a few seconds, our attention shifted away from history and back to the reminder that we're guests in a very old Florida landscape. Then we kept walking. After exploring the ruins, we wandered down toward the old boat landing. That's where we accidentally stumbled onto one of my favorite discoveries of the day: catface trees. If you've never seen one before, they're pine trees that were scarred decades ago so workers could collect pine resin for products like turpentine and rosin. The long vertical scars almost look like whiskers stretching down the trunk, giving them the nickname catface. I was excited because Dusty had never really seen them before, so I got to show her exactly what she was looking at. Then we found something even cooler. One of the trees still had part of the old metal hardware nailed to it. A small piece of forgotten industry still attached to a living tree. Moments like that are one of the reasons I love exploring. Sometimes history isn't inside a museum. Sometimes it's quietly growing in the woods, waiting for someone curious enough to notice. Today, Bulow Plantation ruins is peaceful. The walls remain, the machinery is gone. The fields have become forest again. Visitors come to admire the beauty of the ruins, and they should. They're remarkable. But I hope we also remember everything that isn't standing anymore. The cabins, the families, the lives that built this place, the conflict that destroyed it. Bulow Plantation isn't simply the story of one family losing its fortune. It's the story of nearly 200 enslaved people whose labor made that fortune possible. It's the story of the Seminole people fighting to remain on their homeland. And it's the story of how quickly power, wealth, and ambition can disappear while the consequences remain for generations. Every ruined wall here represents more than architecture. It represents human lives. That's why places like this matter. Not because they're beautiful ruins, but because every ruin was once someone's everyday life. Sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do isn't rebuild the past. It's simply refuse to forget it. If you enjoyed exploring Bulow Plantation ruins with us, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments. And until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop looking for the stories hidden just beneath the surface.